I don't see myself as a part of God's house. At best, I would see myself as a visitor within God's house who had no choice but to be in God's house. If I was in my own house and I dragged somebody into my house through no choice of their own, and then forced them to undergo some suffering, and then threw some money at them and said, I have the right to do this because firstly, this is my house, and secondly, I've compensated for it. So if anything, you should be grateful. I think this would be gross.
Right, because when human beings exhibit that kind of autonomy over other human beings, we call that slavery.
That you said there. The first thing was about epistemic distance, which we haven't spoken about yet. You say, well, maybe the reason that God puts a distance between himself and us is for the same reason that a parent might distance themselves from a child, such that they don't feel constantly overbearing. They need the freedom to be able to choose to do things for their own sake, not because they feel like somebody's watching over their shoulder. But pay close attention to what I'm asking for here. I'm not asking for a constant and continual washing over of divine presence that follows me around everywhere I go and I'm unable to avoid seeing it. I'm just asking for something, just once, just one experience in my life that speaks to the existence of a creator of the universe. But once.
Sure, but
this would not be overbearing. This would not be enough to make me, to impinge upon my freedom. This would not be enough to make me feel that every time I was doing a moral decision, I had someone watching over my shoulder. This would just be enough to establish the existence. In the same way that a parent may distance themselves from a child in order to allow that child to grow up freely. Nobody likes a parent that hovers over their child for all their lives. But I can assure you that that child has had some experience in their life where they've become convinced that their parent does in fact exist. This will be because they've at least once in their experience had direct experience of that parent. That's all I'm asking for here. So I don't think that objection works. Equally with the orphans, sure, the equivalent of the orphans saying like, look, our parents were terrible, so we have no parents. That obviously doesn't follow. But you're asking me here, like, or the premise of this is why I'm not a Christian, and no Christian God is the kind of God that would be subject to that kind of analogy. Finally, you said that we can imagine a world in which there is suffering as being more worthwhile because there are certain goods which are parasitic upon certain evils. You can't have compassion without suffering. You can't have forgiveness without evil and immorality and these kinds of things. And so God actualizes a world in which these evils exist in order to allow for these second order goods. Now, there was a question that I asked in a podcast that myself and Trent and Cameron and Joe did recently, but I more asked it to Cameron, but I'm interested to ask it to you now because we didn't really discuss it from your perspective, which is when somebody says, well, I'm glad we live in a world where there is pain and suffering because this allows us to have things like compassion and bravery, and it allows us to have forgiveness, which wouldn't be possible if we didn't have these evils to respond to. The example I gave yesterday was that of Martin Luther King Jr., who is widely considered to be a good man. Okay, why is he good? Because he overcame the evils of racism. Sure. Are we glad to find ourselves in a world where there has been this kind of racism so that we can have the good of something like overcoming it with Martin Luther King? Or would we rather live in a world where there were no racism in the first place and no need for Martin Luther King? Forgiveness and compassion, these things are only good insofar as they overcome some evil. I'd rather do without the evil and without the need to overcome it. Saying that it's good to have the evil so that we can get good out of overcoming it is just like saying that we should be very glad of the existence of cancer, because if we didn't have cancer, then we wouldn't be able to reach the good of cancer research and people coming up with chemotherapy. This seems to me ridiculous, and I imagine that you would take problem with that analogy, because surely, at least in the case of something like cancer research, and possibly with the Martin Luther King example, I mean, would you rather live in a world where there had been no racism and no need for Martin Luther King, or in a world where there was racism, so that we get the good of combating racism? That just to me seems bizarre.
I think the way to answer that is to say, well, suppose we lived in an alternative world that did not have racism, but it had every other evil. Perhaps it's a world where everyone belonged to the same race, and we had all the same evils we still have right now. I suspect your probability about God wouldn't change that much, given all the other evils that exist. So there's so many other evils. You'd rather live in a world with or without racism. There's still so many other evils associated with human beings. That question you asked me is like asking, wouldn't the world be better without human beings? Like, surely our world without genocide and rape and eat human evils, wouldn't the world just be better without human beings? And my answer is no, it would not be better, actually, because humans also bring unique goods with them, and the harm inflicted by the evils can be conquered and overcome. But ultimately, when I hear your protestation, and it's a rightful protestation you have against evil, you speak about it as if it's this objective thing that's wrong, that we have a duty to remove. And I have a hard time squaring that on an atheistic worldview, the views of either there being objective good and objective right and wrong, or of intrinsic human dignity. Humans have this value that non-humans do not have, which informs many of our moral judgments, to prefer human welfare over the welfare of other creatures. So that's the other bright spot in the evil that I can't explain without God.
I feel like this is a misguided objection. The reason is that what I'm doing here is I'm offering what might sometimes be called an internal critique of Christianity. Mm-hmm. I'm not claiming that there exist objective moral standards. You are. So what I'm saying is that for me, the problem of evil and suffering is not a problem. It's exactly what I expect to find in the world. For the Christian, it is a problem because you are asserting the existence of objective goodness and you are asserting the existence of an objectively good God. And so when I say that, like, God wouldn't allow this evil to take place, and you might say, well, as an atheist, how can you even call it evil? Well, this is what I'm asking you to describe, because you're the one claiming that there is an objective moral standard, and I'm saying that if there is an objective moral standard, then these examples of evil and suffering, or apparent evil and suffering, you are required to incorporate these into your worldview of objective morality. I don't know, it's a bit
I'm required?
It's a bit like, well, yeah, you must be. If you want to contend that there's a moral God, you need to include within the permissibility of that moral God the suffering that we see in the world, which I think you would trivially agree that that's something that you have to do. But can I just say, it's like, imagine you were having a discussion with like a flat earther or something. Not to make a comparison, I'm not saying this is anything like that.
I've done an episode on flat earth, it's interesting.
Yeah, I've done the same, it's quite good fun. But I can imagine somebody kind of saying like, imagine you're the flat earther and I'm criticizing the flat earth hypothesis, and I say, well, if the earth is flat, then, you know, how do planes sort of get from this part of the world to this part of the world? It would seem like it would be ridiculous to suggest that they could fly over this entire huge disk or around the big ice wall at the other side. And you said something like, but I thought you believed in a globe Earth. So, you know, how can you say, that there's a problem with these planes flying around the equator because you believe it's a globe, right? It's like, yeah, but I'm criticizing your position. You think there's the flat Earth, and so you have to explain why you have this, how you solve this problem of the planes going around. So in the same way, when you say you're a Christian, I say I'm an atheist, I say, well, then how do you explain the problem on Christianity of the existence of evil and suffering? And you're saying, well, I thought you were an atheist. Where are you getting this evil and suffering thing from? It's like, well, I'm actually just criticizing your position here. You're the one who has to account for it, not me. Mm-hmm.
Alex's point is actually very reasonable. He's not asking for constant proof or some overwhelming presence. He's asking for just one clear experience that shows God exists. That wouldn't remove free will. In everyday life, we believe things exist because we experience them. Parents, other people, the world around us, we don't just guess, we have evidence. The Bible itself says in Jeremiah 29:13 that if you seek God, you will find him. But many sincere people search and never get that clear answer. That creates a real problem. Then there's the argument about evil. Some say suffering exists so we can have compassion or bravery. But that doesn't hold up logically. You don't need cancer to justify medical progress. A world without suffering would still be better than one where people have to suffer just to create good. Alex also makes a strong philosophical point. He's not claiming objective morality exists. He's saying Christians claim it does. If God is perfectly good, then the amount of suffering in the world needs a clear explanation.
Well, you could have a worldview that doesn't require objective good or objective evil. You're just saying that the Christian worldview, you're not going to adopt it because it has these inconsistencies in it. But I'm not sure that really works, because I still think that there are moral duties being smuggled in here that you're not just saying, hey, it's really strange that you have this inconsistent view, because people have all kinds of strange, inconsistent views. I mean, I enjoy comic books, and in comic books, there's something called retroactive continuity. It's necessary because comic book plots get totally inconsistent with one another. Superheroes have one power one day, next issue a totally different power. You say, hey, what about this or that? And it's interesting. Well, we don't give it that much of a second thought. It's not as important. But the idea that I ought to be consistent in how I treat animals, for example, who are in factory farms, or God, if God exists, God ought to act in a certain way. And now, so it seems to me you're still trying to posit, okay, well, there's this contradiction in view here. But if it's my system, if I have the whole system, and then I say, well, Alex, so here are these other elements like God redeeming evil, compensating people with happiness. To me, it's not just you're saying your system's incoherent, because then you say, well, I think the probability of all of this being true is low. And so it's not just an internal critique. You're saying it doesn't map to reality, even if I can make it consistent with other goods, with reasons, with things like that.
Yeah, I'm not saying you can't do this. I think you can. I think you can offer some great responses to the problem of evil, and explain why it is that God would allow evil. The only thing I'm pushing back on is specifically what you said, that me making the case from the problem of evil, the problem of suffering, if you prefer, is somehow a problem because I can't say that there is objective evil in the world. I don't need to. All I need to say is that if there is such thing as objective morality, it needs to offer an account of what would become these evils, this kind of suffering. Then it would need to offer an account. So say it's not a problem for me. It's a problem for you. I'm not saying you can't do that.
Right.
I'm just saying that it's not right to say that I can't really make this criticism because I don't believe in objective morality. I'm saying you believe in objective morality,
right.
So you need to offer an account of how objective morality will permit the kind of evils and sufferings that we see. For example, animal suffering, which is potentially the best thing to talk about. Now, when I speak about animal suffering, I'm not talking about the suffering that we inflict upon animals in factory farms, because this is quite easy to explain. Human beings are free creatures, they're sinful creatures. They commit horrendous evils. What I'm talking about is the suffering of animals in the wild. You can imagine a situation of a tree falling over and trapping a deer's leg, and that deer spends the rest of its life in confusion and agony until it starves. If Christianity is true and suffering is redeemed, we need an account of this. Now, you could just say this deer goes to heaven. Feels like a bit of a disposal problem to me, but you could say that. There's still an interesting question about whether any being could have the right to do this kind of thing. An interesting point that's raised by David Benatar is that there seems to be a difference between our right to inflict suffering, if it's to prevent further suffering, or if it's to provide good. In other words, if I have to unconsensually inflict suffering upon somebody, but it's the only thing I can do to prevent much greater suffering to them, it seems like I'm justified in doing it. It seems like I have the right to inflict it. If I can break their arm to stop them from drowning because I need to kind of pull them through a gap where water's filling up, I'm allowed to inflict suffering to prevent greater suffering. But if I could break somebody's arm unconsensually, and it doesn't prevent greater suffering, it just gives them something really good. Maybe it gives them like an encyclopedic knowledge of geography, and they want to be a geography professor. Or maybe it just gives them this wonderful feeling of elation, or just some positive good. It seems that unconsensually, I don't have the right to inflict that. Even if it's something that's kind of going to make them better off, even if they would say that they'd rather have an encyclopedic knowledge of geography rather than have a functioning arm for a while, I can't unconsensually inflict this suffering to bring about a great good in the way that I can inflict a suffering to bring about a great evil. So there's an interesting question about, even if we are being compensated for our suffering, whether or not somebody should have the right to inflict that suffering just on the grounds that it's going to be compensated for. There's a club called the Bullingdon Club, which is famous in Oxford for being this kind of depraved gang of teenage Etonites. The kind of people who end up going on to be our prime ministers. Boris Johnson and David Cameron were both members of this club. It has a reputation for these young, rich kids, before they were in the public eye, they go for dinner and they would just trash the place. They would be completely, they'd cause a racket. They would rip the place apart. They'd flip over the tables. They'd tear down the wallpaper. And the idea was they were so rich that what they would do is they would just throw some money at the person who owned the place and throw them way more money than the meal was worth and way more money than it takes to fix up the place, as if to say, like, yeah, you're going to be fine with this because, yeah, sure, we came into your place and we disrespected you and we completely wrecked your restaurant, but we've just paid you enough money to fix it and then some. I still think that they've wronged them, even if they've compensated them for something. As long as it's being done unconsensually and in a way that a person, doesn't get a say. And I still think they've done something wrong there, even if they're being compensated. And that's even if we grant that these animals will be compensated in the afterlife, that there is such thing as a deer heaven, which I must say I'm quite skeptical of. If there's not, we've got an even bigger problem. How on earth can we explain the meaning behind the suffering of this deer with its leg trapped under the tree that's starving in confused agony? I don't know what you would say.
I have two thoughts. One, I don't think the analogy works because for God allowing suffering and the boys there in tearing up the club, they don't own that club. Like if someone came to my house and tore it up and then gave me a bunch of money, I'd be highly inconvenienced nonetheless to have to fix everything. I'd still be mad even if I was grateful for the money because it's my house, not theirs. But this is God's house. So he's sovereign over it. And so I think it changes the analogy a lot. And then number two, hearing you talk, I feel like, wait, we're shifting gears. I wouldn't have the right to do this. I wouldn't be justified in doing this. So when I point that out to you, say, well, I'm not saying that, I'm not affirming this. It's an internal problem for you. But then when you describe the world, I feel like you're slipping back into using this objective kind of language to describe the way that they are. So for me, when I see this, it still doesn't provide a defeater that God is, that he's not all powerful. Like you've posed one question, how do we explain the deer, the suffering of the deer? Here are some possible options. I don't know how plausible they are. I can do the same thing, like with my argument from intrinsic human dignity. Why is it the case that we can experiment on rats, kill pigs when we need to promote human flourishing, but we don't do that to human infants, even though they are not cognitively superior to these beings? Like pigs are very intelligent, rats are intelligent. And if we say that for infants, well, you could make it extrinsic, it's just how we care about them. Well, when our feelings run out, that's dangerous for them. But if it's intrinsic just to the fact that members of the human species have value, non-humans do not, to me, while with animal suffering, I can give you explanations you find more or less plausible, I don't think atheism can do that for human dignity when it comes to the reason why. Because even when we talk to suffering, it's so interesting. I think that human suffering is something of a worse quality than animal suffering.
Now look at animal suffering. Not human evil, nature itself. A deer crushed under a tree, starving in pain. This happens every day. No lesson, no growth, just suffering. Evolution explains this clearly. Natural selection runs on death, pain, and survival. That's science, not design. And then Christians say it's all part of a plan? Or animals get rewarded later? That doesn't fix anything. Causing suffering first and paying it back later is still wrong. And let's not ignore this. Christianity itself required blood sacrifice. Go read Leviticus. Animals killed over and over to please God. Why would a moral system demand that?
So I don't think they're. So I think
so. The question is simple: if God is good, why build a world like this?
Sort of qua instance of suffering is experienced the same by humans and other animals. I think that the thing that would make a human being worth more than a pig wouldn't be that its suffering somehow counts for more, but that there's more of it and there's a bigger depth of it and there are different kinds of it that exist within the human, such that the human's suffering is not worth more than the pig's suffering, but the human is worth more than the pig. But I wanted to just, again, respond because you said that, again, I'm kind of injecting this language. You said that I was talking about why would God have the right to do this. Maybe I can just rephrase this and maybe it will, because I feel like there still must be some confusion here. The point that I'm making there is saying something like, if you want to assert that God can allow this deer in his house to go through this suffering because he's being compensated for, this is being compensated for.
And I agree that you can rewrite it to have an emotivist description. All I do is...
I'm not rewriting it to be an emotivist account. What I'm saying is that the criticism I was making is that you appear committed to the view then that God has the right to do this. Now, you seem to think that, but that's the only point I was making. When I say, like, there's a question here about whether we have the right to inflict suffering in order to bring about some great good, what I'm basically saying there, in other words, is, look, Trent, if you want to use this response that it's okay that this deer is suffering because it will be compensated in the afterlife, you're committed to the view that God has the right to inflict suffering upon creatures as long as he makes up for it, as long as he, throws the money at you at the end of the day in the way that the Bullingdon Club boys throw the money at the owner of the restaurant. This seems to me like quite an asinine idea. I don't think that that's how it works. You also talked about...
Wait, so it seems to you, what you're saying is you just don't agree with it?
Yeah,
that God can allow us to suffer if he compensates us, and your objection is, well, that's asinine.
I don't see myself as a part of God's house. At best, I would see myself as a visitor within God's house who had no choice but to be in God's house. If I was in my own house and I dragged somebody into my house through no choice of their own and then forced them to undergo some suffering and then threw some money at them and said, I have the right to do this because firstly, this is my house, and secondly, I've compensated for it. So if anything, you should be grateful. I think this would be gross.
Right, because when human beings exhibit that kind of autonomy over other human beings, we call that slavery. But when I tell my kids, what?
It's funny that, isn't it?
Right, but if I bent you over my knee and whapped your behind, I would be a crazy person.
We get a lot of views, I think.
Yeah, maybe not the ones we want. But if I were to discipline my own children, it changes dramatically because I do have moral authority over them in virtue of having caused their existence and in being given the responsibility to raise them. And so in virtue of that, then if God causes our existence and he is the absolute source of goodness itself, then it still makes sense, then the analogy doesn't hold up. But for me, I am seeing the suffering and this other things, I still think they're the plausible answers. But when we go back and we talk about suffering across these different fields, well, do you think that in the ethical life, our actions should promote the flourishing of the human species over other species?
I'm not sure I would commit myself to a principle, kind of put that blandly. Not blandly, I don't mean that in an insulting way. I mean sort of put so generically. I'm not sure because there may be situations in which promoting some level of non-human suffering is worth focusing on rather than promoting some lower level of human suffering or something like this. But if you mean like all other things being equal, should we promote the welfare of humans over animals? A qualified yes, because of course I don't think that like a human's well-being is intrinsically more valuable than a pig's or a cow's. I just think it's of a different kind. Like I'm trying to think about how best to explain this. When I said earlier that a human's suffering is not worth more than a pig's suffering, but the human is worth more because of the kinds of suffering it's capable of. When we talk about promoting human welfare over animal welfare, I'm imagining something like this. I'd say, like, if you had humans who were like pigs in every respect, in terms of their cognitive ability and stuff, then maybe we should be promoting their welfare equally. But because they're not, we don't.
Oh, wait a minute. I want to make sure I understood what you just said. Because I believe that human beings who are permanently at the cognitive level of certain non-human animals, so these would be severely mentally handicapped human beings, I believe their welfare should still far and above exceed the welfare we give to the non-human animals. I believe the severely mentally handicapped should be given they have far more dignity and deserve more respect than non-human animals, even if they are at the same functional level. And that's solely in virtue of their humanity. Do you agree or disagree with that thesis?
Of course, as an emotivist, I agree. It's kind of, again, a qualified agreement because being an ethical emotivist, ethical statements for an emotivist are essentially just expressions of emotion that don't contain any truth value. And I can explain why it is I'm of the psychological predisposition to prefer the well-being of a human being over a pig. I don't know if I can justify that, but as an emotivist, I'm not dealing with a realm of objective ethics that can be justified at all. All I can talk about is like my emotive response.
But I guess then what's hard is, let's say here's my Christian ethical worldview, and
Yes.
it includes this moral proposition. God has the right to allow us to suffer if he compensates us in the afterlife. And I hear from you, that's asinine. So if that's just an emotional reply, like that makes me feel bad and I don't like it, in the world of moral discourse, I can reply with, I don't care, because it's not a reason.
But of course, for me, for an emotivist, that is, ethical debate, ethical statements, ethical propositions that are put forward are just highly evolved apes expressing themselves at each other. But for you, that's not what's going on. So,
Right? Yeah, we're not just flinging poo at each other.
so it's
That's
kind of,
correct.
it's not so much, it's not kind of a problem for me as long as I'm willing to just admit that that's all that's going on.
Right, and so, and this will get down to a crux of our disagreement about the nature of human beings and of morality. And I do think it's important people to understand. Obviously, you and I are sharing our differences because there are atheists and non-theists who don't believe in God and also reject your ethical worldview. And there's theists who reject my ethical worldview.
Sure.
But I think it's helpful for us to engage one another because especially if a more robust ethic of human dignity, moral realism, at least points stronger at God, that gives me reason to go in that direction if the alternatives like emotivism are, for me, it would point back to Christianity. If these are the other alternatives that are most live on the table away from God, like emotivism, I don't find it plausible. Like they're not coherent. Like, for example, if ethical descriptions are just expressions of emotional states, it doesn't seem to make very much sense of moral argument. Like I can make an argument like murder is wrong. If murder is wrong, then it is wrong for my friend to commit murder. Therefore, it is wrong for my friend to commit murder, which seems hard to do under emotivism.
Yes. So A.J. Ayer addresses this in chapter 7 of Language, Truth, and Logic, which is kind of the place where the emotivist school of thought really got off the ground. And he pointed out that what most people call moral debate is a lot of the time not moral debate at all. If you're having a debate about, say, the ethics of gun ownership or something, somebody might say, well, guns kill a lot of people. And someone else says, no, guns actually kill less people than you think. And more people are saved by guns than are killed by guns. And you're more likely to die in a swimming pool. But you could just put a fence up. These kinds of, this debate, and this is the kind of topics that will often be discussed, these are not moral claims. These are just descriptive, factual claims.
I disagree. Like with abortion, it boils down to you should be allowed to directly end a fetus's life. You should not be allowed to do that.
But look at what so much of the discussion around abortion is. We'll talk about, is it a human being, yes or no? Like, is it sentient? Can it feel? Is it viable outside of a womb? This kind of things. Is it relevantly similar to it? These are descriptive claims. Now, of course, there is a moral element. I'm not saying that this isn't a problem. It is kind of a problem for emotivism that it makes it difficult to make sense of moral discussion. What I'm saying is the problem isn't as big as I think you're making it out to be, because so much of moral discussion, we're actually arguing about descriptive qualities. Pay attention the next time you're having a moral debate with somebody and notice how many of the things you're arguing about, you'll be like, let's look at the facts, let's look up the statistics. You're talking about descriptive claims.
And I would say, like, when I've had abortion, I can't count the number of times I've heard, yeah, it's a baby, but I can do what I want with my body. That would be a differing moral claim, not a differing descriptive claim.
So, of course, within the debates, you do still have this moral disagreement that you need to make sense of. For the emotivist, this is just emotive states kind of clashing up against each other. But, of course, people's emotive states can change. As you can kind of, what would be called moral debate by someone who's not an emotivist would be best described by the emotivist as a situation in which somebody kind of feels something but comes to realize that they might actually have another feeling which kind of...
Do you think we can control our feelings?
No, I don't think so.
That makes it very interesting to hold people responsible for their moral beliefs then.
Yes, it does. Yeah, that's one of the big problems of, I wouldn't say one of the big problems of atheism, but certainly one of the big problems of determinism, of lack of free will, is it completely undermines traditional morality and moral responsibility.
And that's the thing for me. Like, when you, and I understand how you've cached things here. Like, it seems like I have my view, and within this coherent, objective moral view, God has a moral responsibility to not let deer suffer or not let certain bad things happen. But I do think part of that bleeds into a deep-seated intuition that human beings uniquely are morally responsible for their actions and can be held accountable. That if I say to you, like, and I'm taking your ethical veganism real seriously. I am going to dive into it and pick one side or the other. But if I just said to you, Alex, I just don't care. If they're in fact, I like meat and I don't care, I think you would say that I'm a morally blameworthy, intellectually lazy person who's not taking serious moral matters into consideration. But I think, like, honestly, most tigers don't really care. The meat just tastes good to them. So I do. So for me as a Christian, like, one reason I am a Christian is back to that uniqueness of human beings. I don't see how atheism really explains not just our dignity, how we should be treated, but how we ought to treat others. I find that hard to explain on atheism.
Yeah, there are a lot of things to unpack there. Firstly,
Sure.
I wouldn't quite, I think you slightly mischaracterize exactly the point that I'm making, which is not, I didn't say something like, I can't remember exactly what you said there. You said something like, God kind of doesn't have the warrant to inflict suffering upon animals or something like this, as if I'm making an argument that God can't do this. I'm not saying that God shouldn't do this. I'm not saying God doesn't have the right to inflict the suffering.
Mm-hmm.
All I'm saying is that I'd like an explanation that takes the form of saying why he has the justification. Of course, if there is a perfectly loving God, then he does have justification for the things that he does, because there'd be no way that he couldn't do, right? So what I'm saying, I'm not saying God doesn't have this justification. I'm saying, I'm kind of asking a question of, like, well, if I have to assume there is such a justification to be a Christian, like,
Well, it sounds like you're saying
what is
God
that
doesn't have a
justification?
right to do it because it seems like no such justification exists.
I'm saying it seems to me, I guess it would seem to me that there is no such justification. At least I have no reason to think that there's a justification as an atheist. Of course, I guess if you're a Christian, you can again do the modus ponens, modus tollens shift and say that as long as I'm confident that a God exists, I know that there will be some reason for this. That's fine. You can do that, I guess. But I'm trying to remember the second thing you said while you were talking about.
It's just the uniqueness of
dignity
moral
of
responsibility.
human beings. Oh yes, you said that if you just said, like, look, I just don't care.
Oh yeah, that I'm responsible for the moral beliefs I have.
This is kind of going to depend on your meta-ethical theory, right? Because if you said that, then I'd be like, Trent, what are you talking about? You're a Catholic. Like, you believe that these moral imperatives are important. But I meet a great deal of people, for instance, who are ethical egoists.
Mm-hmm.
They say that I don't believe that ethics exists objectively. I think people just chase after what they want to do, and that there's no problem with this. There's no morality. There's no anything. And so they say to me, they come to my talks on veganism, and they listen, and they say, look, I like what you're saying, but what if I just don't care? What if I just don't agree? Now, I could tell them that they're being kind of intellectually lazy, or I could say that they're not taking it seriously or whatever. But I think these people are being honest and serious. It's like, this is a serious position that needs to be taken into account. So I might argue that they're not as egoistic as they think they are. I might try to talk them through it, but, like, it is a serious argument. So if like an ethical egoist said to me, "Oh, I just don't care," I'd be like, okay, well, let's see if you do care. I mean, would you
sound like you try to argue in their own system.
Exactly. That's exactly what I do. So in the same way that
and I see the merit in that. But do you agree that sometimes when we have ethical disagreements with people, a person's ethical system is so stacked towards defending immorality, one has to show the system is false?
But so can I, when you said a moment ago that something like a lack of free will undermines traditional moral responsibility,
Yes, yeah.
I think you're right. And so what we're just left with here is descriptive statements. We're just kind of left with descriptivity, because there's no moral responsibility. There's no ethics in the traditional sense if we throw off free will. So what we're left with is the descriptive. So what I do from that perspective is I look at other people's descriptive claims. I look at facts about the things that they're claiming. So I see a man who says, I am a Catholic, I believe there is an objective moral truth, I care about suffering in some circumstances, and I eat factory farmed meat. And I say that somewhere lurking in there, I think there might be a descriptive inconsistency. And that's what I'm doing in a situation like that. And it's just like the situation of trying to trying to. Are we running out of time? Q&A.
Yeah, we'll do.
Q&A
Let's.
shortly. Yeah, just like earlier when I was saying that I'm kind of making an internal critique of Christianity when I talk about evil and suffering. Like as an atheist, how can I talk about evil and suffering? I'm making an internal critique. Similarly, when I kind of make moral statements, because your big criticism here seems to be that I'm somehow injecting or smuggling in these moral assumptions. And what I'm saying is I'm working on the immoral assumptions that you're giving me and seeing if they're descriptively consistent. Or see if they lead to kind of descriptive.
And I will be honest with you, Alex, I do feel like, I know you speak as if, morality is about emotivist descriptions we have from each other. And you say, well, why hasn't God revealed himself to me? I honestly believe the zeal that you have to challenge me, Matt Dillahunty, other people, to be consistent and do what feels right to you emotionally. I'm telling you, man, I feel like Romans 2:14-15 says, there are the Gentiles to whom the law was not given, but the law was written on their hearts. And so they will be judged upon that, which will either accuse or excuse them. So I do think that, and this is echoing what Joe Schmid said in a discussion we had earlier, that I believe you've complained to not have this relationship with God, but I feel like you're even more in tune with pursuing the good and the true in the face of serious opposition than many other people. And so you do have that in ways you may not see as clearly now. But yeah, so I guess it's interesting. It looks like being Christian or not Christian, it looks like it's like there's a creator and then revealed in Christ. It's like we're stuck here in this limbo, like, is the creator good or not? That's basically what we focused on, essentially. That seems to be the biggest crux for you, that like if this could be overcome, maybe we could span the whole gap. I don't know.
Well, of course, the problem of evil doesn't sufficiently respond to, shall we say, theism broadly. It doesn't on its own give us good reason to think.
Trent says humans are special, so their value is higher. There's no evidence for that. Biology shows humans and animals share the same evolutionary process. Mammals have similar nervous systems. Pain is processed in similar ways. A pig or a deer feels suffering just like we do. Then look at the claim about God causing suffering and rewarding it later. If a human forced someone to suffer and then compensated them, we would call that abuse. Changing the actor to God does not change the outcome. Saying God owns everything does not solve the problem. Ownership does not give the right to inflict suffering. That idea has been used throughout history to justify control over others. Then the standard shifts. Humans are given intrinsic value, animals are not, even when the suffering is the same. That is not consistent. What you end up with is a system where suffering is allowed, humans are elevated without evidence, and God is beyond moral accountability. So here's the question. If a belief system can't clearly explain suffering, especially innocent suffering, why trust it? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear where you stand on this. If you want the full context and deeper discussion, go watch part 2 of this debate. And if you found this helpful, make sure to like and subscribe for more breakdowns like this.